Hey everyone, so I just wanted to kind of get started on my new project. I am currently working on my thesis, Community Narratives for Architecture, site at Christianberg Institute. For me, working on my thesis has been an experience where I want to intertwine storytelling, architecture, and community design together. I'm trying to understand my role as a designer and how can that be influenced if I'm more involved with the community. Long term, that's kind of where I want to take my career. So I'm using this as a case study to kind of better understand how I can use my role as a designer to help my community in the future. So I chose Christianberg Institute because it is a site that is very, very personal to me. But also I feel like it's a place that has been underrepresented, especially for the Black community within Southwest Virginia. So I chose this site and I'm hoping to kind of bring a new architecture component to the space, which I'm trying to use by being influenced through interviews and personal stories, narratives, surveys, anyone that can kind of define what was that space then, whether what it looked like or what did it feel like, how was it kind of fit for the community, how has that changed since it closed down, and how are people still impacted by this space, and kind of seeing the role that people can also influence how designers use their platform. So the biggest thing is, can we tell a story for the community and with the community through design? So let me narrow this. So while I was visiting the site, I came across a quote by one of the people who actually work at the site, and they were kind of showing me around, and they mentioned that only 2% of the 95,000 entries of the National Registration of Historic Places have been deemed worthy of preservation by the federal government for experience with African Americans. And so it's kind of important that of everything that's been preserved, there's been so many that really represent the African American community. And I kind of want to understand what is that, who decides what gets to stay, who decides that there's a level of importance, and who decides how we get to actually show value to these spaces. So my main goal right now is learning just how to investigate my role as a designer, using this that my grandmother, grandfather, great aunt, great uncle, and many other family members attended this site while it was still open, and that how it influenced them has then become a legacy for me. And I want to do a space to honor that legacy, but also honor what Christianberg Institute meant for many families in the community. So right now I kind of broke down my thesis project into 3 categories: narratives, site planning, and program. The idea that the narratives will come from interviews or the surveys. The site planning will be coming from my own research, and again, those narratives, and me thinking about what would I like to bring to the site, and then me also looking at programming, being like, will this space be more about education, for memorial, museum, like what can I bring overall to really propose for my new architecture program for my thesis. So I made a little timeline kind of showing different sections that I was working on. Originally, I started just by looking at and doing some site visits. Just through ethnography with Virginia Tech, I was understood that I may have to look into HRPP. However, I have been able to not use that as part of my project, so that protocol has no longer been part of use. As exactly what I'm doing with the storytelling, it does not fit into HRPP protocols. So additionally, I've been looking at doing some research online about the space, but also talking to people, seeing what's in the archives, which will then lead to me looking at schematic development, schematic ideas for what the actual site could be and the building, doing some mappings of the space, which will then eventually for the rest of the semester lead me to finish my interviews, the drawings, and a final product, which will be done in rendering. So as I was kind of doing my research, Christianberg Institute was originally 185 acres, and I had estimated that it was about 5.6 acres left. However, I've been informed that it's actually less than that because the site in this section right here is not currently owned under Christianberg Institute. However, has completely gone down in size. It was originally 14 buildings, and there's only 1 building left, the Long Building. So I went to go visit the site recently, and so I took a few photos based on like me looking at my family's history, the fact that Booker T. Washington there was up for a certain point of time, and just looking at the building that's there currently. And then looking at the timeline of how these buildings have developed on the site and how they've left. And then looking at the idea of what was Christiansburg Institute used for, which originally its main use was for agriculture and then became an overall trade school, which included cooking, sewing, carpentry, agriculture, wheelwriting, blacksmithing, and printing. The school continued to develop over the years and unfortunately closed down in the 60s. So then my next role is looking at where does Christiansburg Institute sit within the Christiansburg community, but also looking at the site now and what it is. And so I decided to look at different GIS maps and topography to see the exact same site and how it's developed over time, looking at different buildings. And so I was able to also find a few different plots, different like types of blueprints and drawings that really showed what the site existed at different points in time and how different buildings, either the use of the building changed or different buildings were either demolished and new buildings came, and how the acres were actually defined. So I took that information and I'm currently looking at including all, not just the buildings, but just really important areas on the site to create a current site map, which I'm doing digitally, and also looking at photos to see where things are to be exact and to understand how the land changed over time. And then I'm also looking at what that site is now currently. What are the borders? What's left? What's surrounding the site? How is that space being used for the community? Is it not? And in what ways can it be redeveloped? So during my site visit, I was able to really understand and look at the different materials within the site, which was really helpful for me to understand kind of what that space looked like during different periods. Again, some more pictures from my site visit. And then during my research, I came across a few articles where a few attendees of the site had been interviewed. And one that had kind of stood out to me was the mentioning that people would go as far as like 70-mile road trips to get there. People were being housed in dormitories to be there, and how much of the space that people were coming from far and wide just to be educated. And that this sense of community was a lot larger than what we'd consider Southwest Virginia to be. And I really want to understand like what that legacy could look like. So for me to understand, starting off, I'll be interviewing 4 prime people. Again, my grandmother, my grandfather, my great aunt and great uncle about their experiences there, in addition to what was the site like for them, and including just the name, age, did they migrate from the space now, and the answer to my main questions. My main idea during the interview will be to ask what landmarks were originally at the Institute. How did migration happen after the Institute disbanded? How did the recipients perceive community spaces at that time? How do they perceive them now? And ideally, what would recipients want built to honor the legacy? These questions have been a little bit redeveloped for the interview. I believe there's currently 6 questions. However, I'm using those questions just to kind of lead into these main points that I'm really trying to figure out. So another quote that I saw during my article's reading was that the closing of the community was kind of bittersweet. Based on racial integration, much was gained, I think, as an overall community, but the sense of belonging was lost. And I'll kind of just second that growing up in the community, because you weren't talking to people from different counties and different areas, you really only met the people within your school or within your family. So I feel like unless you really had that sense of community, especially within the Black community, within your area, that sense of identity kind of was lost over time. So I've been taking all the information I've been gathering, taking some site ideas, doing some programming, really some basic schematic sketches, going into what I'm thinking about, how I'm thinking that light will be used, how I think building parts will be used, technology, how will people move through the space? These are the questions as an architect that I'm having to ask myself, and how can I tell a story through design? So again, I'm using some more drawings, some more sketches to kind of really understand where I want to take my ideas into, and then taking the ideas that people are also giving me to finalize this. So my goal is I'm asking people to kind of give me feedback on what would they want to be seen. I know with the idea that I can't fulfill every wish, but it just kind of helps me understand that what was wanted in the community, what is wanted now, and that will kind of give me a little bit more purpose to my design, and hopefully that I can come out with a finished product that I can be very proud of, that also can honor different experiences and different people's time at this place. Thank you. And I appreciate you taking the time to really support me during this time.